Welcome to the debate. Our focus today, well, it's on a really specific high-stakes moment in space operations. The recently announced postponement of the Shenzhou 20 crew's return to Earth. These three astronauts were, just wrapping up a 6-month mission on the Tiangong space station. And importantly, their replacements, the Shenzhou 21 crew, they'd already arrived. The handover was done. But the crucial detail, the reason for the delay, is the suspicion that their spacecraft, these Shenzhou 20, might have been struck by a small piece of orbital debris. Now, this risk immediately triggered China's rolling backup mechanism. That means the Shenzhou 22 spacecraft and its Long March 2F rocket were put onto emergency duty standby. So the central disagreement we need to unpack today is what this very prompt, this decisive action, fundamentally tells us about the Chinese manned space program. I'm going to argue that this structured, almost instant deployment of the backup mechanism, it's a resounding signal of operational maturity and, frankly, the exceptional robustness of their safety protocols.
I see why you'd emphasize the preparedness aspect. Yeah. But I come at it from a completely different angle. While having a backup is, obviously necessary, the sheer necessity of activating the full ground-based rescue system for what's described as only a suspected strike by a small piece of debris, that highlights for me not robustness, but a significant, maybe residual operational sensitivity. It suggests perhaps an inherent fragility in the primary vehicle when facing what's become a pretty common hazard in low Earth orbit.
Okay, so let me elaborate on my position. The decision, to postpone the return and initiate the backup plan, it confirms that the primary mandate is crew safety. The health and safety of the astronauts, as they say, comes above absolutely everything else. And prioritizing that safety over sticking to a rigid schedule, that is the absolute defining characteristic of a world-class mature space program. We're talking about a program with a really strong track record here. 37 successful flights, 6 of them manned missions. You look at Commander Tiangong, over 380 cumulative days in space, 6 spacewalks. That demonstrates sustained long-term technical capability, The fact that Shenzhou 22 and its Long March 2F, the whole backup stack, isn't just tucked away somewhere, but kept perpetually ready in emergency duty mode, that's evidence of meticulous, really institutionalized planning for the absolute highest tier of risk. That's proactive strength, not a reaction.
I understand the argument for zero risk tolerance. I do. But I just don't entirely buy that the need for this massive ground-based rescue system is purely a sign of strength. It strongly suggests, to me at least, that the primary return vehicle, the Shenzhou 20 itself, lacks sufficient inherent resilience against these, relatively common LEO debris impacts. Think about the cost, the sheer resources involved in maintaining this rolling backup mechanism. It's not just some plan B on paper, it's a dedicated, fully stacked, fueled rescue rocket kept ready on the pad. The fact that the CMSA acted on a suspected strike, postponing the whole mission instead of, say, relying on onboard assessment or maybe some kind of mitigation, well, it signals that even a potential compromise is seen as a mission-critical threat. A genuinely robust system, in my view, might have redundancy or even on-orbit repair capabilities to absorb or manage this kind of thing without needing to activate a whole new launch from Earth.
I think you're maybe framing the rolling backup mechanism incorrectly, seeing it as a flaw rather than a deliberate strategy. Let's be clear what this thing is. It's a dedicated, fully fueled rescue rocket, essentially sitting on the pad, just waiting for the go-ahead. This system isn't built around hoping the primary craft survives damage. It's built around guaranteeing a rapid, autonomous rescue response if it doesn't.
But that's precisely my point about the trade-offs involved here. Why does a system, even one boasting 37 successful flights, rely on such a huge, dedicated, standing-by launch vehicle back on Earth for what are essentially routine missions now? Activating Shenzhou 22 implies pretty strongly that their risk assessment identified a scenario where Shenzhou 20 could not perform its return function safely. It's an operational philosophy, it seems, that prioritizes that rapid response capability over perhaps building more complex, more redundant, maybe even repairable systems on orbit. That reliance on ground-based rescue points to a significant risk threshold for the primary vehicle itself.
Well, I'd argue this ground backup mechanism is exactly what gives the program its unique structural resilience, especially when you consider the political and operational realities. Remember the geopolitical context. U.S. law bars NASA from cooperating with Chinese astronauts. That essentially forced China to develop comprehensive, completely independent solutions. They can't count on the kind of multi-party contingency planning you often see elsewhere. So this rolling backup isn't just a safety net, it's a structural pillar of their autonomous, self-sufficient capability. It ensures they maintain total control over their astronaut safety entirely internally.
That's a fair point regarding autonomy, sure. But autonomy shouldn't necessarily equate to operational fragility in the primary vehicle. It speaks volumes, I think, that they feel the need to dedicate the immense resources required just to keep Shenzhou 22 launch-ready simply to address the risk of orbital debris damage, a risk every LEO mission faces constantly. Maybe we should shift focus a bit to the timeline and the transparency around the incident itself, because I think that potentially supports this idea of operational sensitivity too.
Okay. Well, the CMSA did provide a direct statement, brief yes, but direct. It explained the delay, cited the suspected cause, small piece of orbital debris, and explicitly said the assessment was underway. Look, in high-stakes space ops, you wait for confirmed data. You don't make major public pronouncements or, worse, attempt maneuvers based on incomplete information. This is the gold standard of professional, measured risk management. The focus was appropriately on procedure, on data analysis.
I'm not entirely convinced it was fully transparent, though. The ambiguity around the timing is notable. Authorities didn't say when the incident is believed to have occurred. We just know that earlier in the week, everything seemed perfectly normal. We had these reports, right? Crews enjoying baked chicken together, doing the handover ceremony, all very routine, very positive. Then suddenly this shift to a crisis footing, a postponement. It suggests either a delay in recognizing the problem's severity, or maybe communication protocols that prioritize damage control and internal confirmation over, let's say, real-time operational disclosure. If the system is truly mature in its communication, why wasn't the possibility of damage mentioned sooner, perhaps when first suspected, rather than waiting until the postponement was a done deal? That lack of initial detail, it could create a perception of controlling the narrative, which isn't quite the same as true operational openness.
Right. But the distinction you're drawing between the handover ceremony and the later postponement is crucial. But I disagree it implies narrative control. I think it simply implies a measured response to a changing risk profile. Routine operations, the ceremony, the meal, they continued successfully until the risk assessment, likely based on telemetry or sensor data, quantified the threat sufficiently to change the operational status. You don't just halt a mission on a hunch, not until the risk is formally assessed. That shows deliberate process, I think, not panic or some kind of obfuscation. They maintained their schedule right up until the data dictated a change. Postponement, activation of the rescue stack. That shows calm, procedural adherence.
Calmness? Yes, I'll grant that. But also extreme caution. A degree of caution that, again, suggests they might have very little margin for error in the Shenzhou return vehicle itself. And let's look at this through the lens of China's bigger ambitions, specifically that goal of landing astronauts on the moon by 2030.
Ah, yes, the perfect context. Because I see this delay, this whole incident, as an essential, almost like a dress rehearsal for deep space operations. Managing risk effectively in LEO, even something as routine now as debris rest, that's the training ground. It's where you hone procedures for managing far greater, potentially unmitigated risks on, say, a lunar mission. The ability to instantly deploy that backup stack, it just reinforces the absolute commitment to the safety of highly experienced people like Tiangong. His institutional knowledge is incredibly valuable for those future deep space goals.
Okay, I agree managing debris strikes is critical training, but here's the flip side. If a small debris strike in the relatively known near-Earth environment of LEO, where rapid ground intervention is actually possible, can delay a planned return and force them to activate Plan B, what does that really imply for the complexity, the safety requirements of a mission to the Moon? On a lunar mission, there is no Long March 2F waiting on a launch pad back home. The entire philosophy has to shift, doesn't it? From ground-based rescue to absolute inherent on-orbit redundancy, self-repair capability maybe, extended environmental resilience. This current operational response, heavily reliant on the ground backup, suggests maybe a shortfall in that primary vehicle resilience that really needs to be addressed before you tackle the, frankly, much higher risks of deep space, where rescue is simply impossible.
I reframe that delay, though, purely as an exercise in supreme caution, proportional to the value of the assets involved, both the spacecraft and the highly experienced crew. The program is currently prioritizing the absolute highest level of crew survivability through this autonomous rapid response capability. It's an operational choice reflecting a philosophy: better to dedicate resources to guarantee a swift rescue near Earth than to risk crew lives on, potentially, complex and untried orbital repair protocols for primary vehicles still operating relatively close to home. Success here proves the decision-making framework is sound, and that's exactly what you need when you're planning an independent lunar mission.
While the program clearly demonstrates impressive readiness and, yes, risk aversion, I still maintain that true advancement, true program maturity, is marked more by increased resilience built into the primary hardware, into Shenzhou 20 itself, not solely through dedicating this immense, fully ready backup stack, Shenzhou 22, back on the ground. The emphasis still feels external rather than internal to the vehicle in orbit.
And I maintain that the successful deployment of Shenzhou 21, the smooth handover, and then the immediate stated activation of Shenzhou 22's emergency duty mechanism, all of this demonstrates a highly professional, deeply risk-averse, and technologically ready space program. They've perfected, arguably, the highest possible level of contingency planning. They aren't just relying on the primary system. They have institutionalized the capability to respond to a critical failure immediately and autonomously.
But the prompt necessity of postponing the mission and activating that full ground-based backup, it suggests that, while necessary, this approach might be, well, perhaps overly cautious in a way that reveals underlying limits in the inherent resilience of the orbiting vehicle itself. And for those ambitious future goals, like the 2030 moon landing, the focus must inevitably shift, I think, away from easily accessible ground-based Plan Bs and towards enhancing internal system resilience and redundancy to mitigate those complex, unavoidable risks far, far from Earth.
I think we've certainly established strong evidence for both things here: the immense progress of the program, its operational successes, and also the extremely high standard of caution it employs in managing every conceivable risk.
Indeed. And the fundamental tension, really, for the program likely remains. Does this impressive preparedness, symbolized by that rescue rocket always waiting in the wings, indicate ultimate operational strength, or does it perhaps highlight a persistent, maybe necessary, reliance on extraordinary measures to overcome an operational vulnerability inherent in the primary vehicle? That's the question.